to the United States, where officials are trying to contain a growing outcry over family separations at the border. President Trump's zero-tolerance policy has sparked protests across the country this weekend, including in McAllen, Texas, where demonstrators gathered outside the Border Patrol Center. We're going to take you there in a moment. Steve Futterman is standing by, but right now, we want to show you the latest remarks that we're getting from the U.S. president on this issue. This is what Donald Trump just sent on Twitter moments ago. Quote, "We cannot allow all of these people to invade our country. When somebody comes in, we must immediately, with no judges or court cases, bring them back from where they came. Our system is a mockery to good immigration policy and law and order. Our immigration policy, laughed at all over the world, is very unfair to all those people who have gone through the system legally and are waiting online for years. Immigration must be based on merit. We need people who will help make America great again." So that is the latest from the U.S. president on the issue. But right now, as we said, let's go to Stephen Futterman. He's in McAllen, Texas right now, just one of the detention centers along the U.S.-Mexico border. So, Steve, at this point, we saw protests there yesterday. What's happening around you right now?
Well, nothing yet today. We do expect some protests later on in the afternoon, but certainly we've seen one change here today. Metal barricades have been put up that may prevent some of the protesters, if they come here, if they take part in demonstrations, from having access to certain areas they had yesterday. Yesterday, it got very tense at one point as there was a bus containing a number of detainees trying to leave this processing center, and the protesters blocked it, tried to prevent it from going anywhere. This went on for around 20 minutes. They had protesters sitting in front of the bus, basically civil disobedience. There were no arrests. There were many heated discussions, but finally the protesters decided to move back, and the bus went somewhere to where we don't know. But this is what I think we may see at various times throughout the upcoming week and days at various processing centers, at various detention centers, as the protesters want to make their voices heard. And they want to really send a message to the American people, to people around the world, that they are not putting up with what is going on here, even though right now it's still happening.
Still happening, as you say, and these protesters motivated by the few images we've seen of children being held in detention, separated from their families, that horrific audio that ProPublica published of crying children in the night. Yeah. But that said, we did hear from Homeland Security, U.S. Homeland Security last night. They were talking about reunification, saying it could take months. What else are we learning from U.S. authorities right now?
Well, they're giving us some numbers for the first time. They told us last night that 522 children have now been reunited with their families. They said another 16 would be reunited by this evening. As far as the remaining children still separated from their parents, they number that at around 2,000. Again, they gave no indication how quickly this may take place, but they certainly prepared everyone that this could be a very long process. They say they know where everyone is. They say everyone's being tracked, both children and parents, but they did send a very cautious warning that they said some children may not. They said it would be a small number, but some children may continue to be separated because they cannot confirm the family relationships, basically saying they need to know for sure who these children are going to before they send them back to their parents or their families.
Well, for more on the migrant crisis at the border along the U.S. and Mexico line, we want to give you now a closer look at a young migrant mother who is reunited with her child. Now, the woman is from Guatemala. Her 5-year-old was taken from her weeks ago by U.S. immigration authorities.
Tan feliz que tengo mi hijo, y soy feliz.
So that was the reunification of mother and child. That video, a part of an investigation put together by Debbie Nathan for The Intercept, which is an online news publication. Now, this woman's case was taken on by a team of lawyers and volunteers who worked to reunite mother and child, but not all the migrants being apprehended get the help they need to find their children. Well, for more on this story, we have asked Debbie Nathan to join us today. She joins us right now, in fact, in Brownsville, Texas. Debbie, thank you for joining us. You know, that video alone, your story, the whole story pulls at the heartstrings, but that video alone is so heart-wrenching. Tell us more about this woman and her child.
She crossed the river on May 7th. She's a victim of severe domestic violence by her partner, who's the father of the child. and to escape him and try to save her life and her son's life, because he was threatening the son as well, she crossed into Mexico and then crossed into the United States on May 7th. She tells me that she was mocked when she was picked up by the Border Patrol, when she told her story about abuse, and the next day she was separated from her little boy. And she was not reunited for 38 days. And what happened was, when I found her in detention, in calling lawyers and other advocates to try to find out what was available for her, one of the lawyers went to visit her and then volunteered to take her case. And the lawyer worked very, very hard to get her through a credible fear hearing, which is something that people go through when they're asking for asylum. She passed. And then the lawyer insisted that she be reunited that very day that she got out of detention. And that happened. Mm-hmm. And that was last week, actually. So it's a very exceptionally successful reunification.
Successful, but as you say, an exception almost to the rule, because we've heard so many stories of families being separated right now. I do want to ask you, though, because this woman, as we say, from Guatemala, is fleeing domestic abuse. She took an inner tube with her 5-year-old, risked their life to cross the Rio Grande to get into the United States. And yet we hear the U.S. president describe so many of these migrants as thieves, as criminals, as gang members. Tell us about the migrants who are crossing over versus the picture that's being painted by the U.S. president.
Well, most of them are, I would say the vast majority of them are people who are fleeing violence in their own countries, and they know how dangerous this is because it's constantly told to them, you know, that you could die and your child could die, and they know that, but they feel that they have a higher chance of dying in their own countries. So they're coming over here really to save their kids' lives. They mostly, the vast majority of them have no criminal record. They're not anything like what President Trump is describing them.
Well, he did, the U.S. president, sign an executive order earlier this week, essentially ending the policy that was introduced in May that separated children from their families. Has that executive order had any effect at the ground level that you've seen so far?
Yes. In fact, in Brownsville, where I live, in the federal court this week, right after that executive order came out, they stopped prosecuting people for illegal entry. They stopped criminalizing these immigrants that they're picking up down by the river. And the same thing happened in El Paso this week. So that's a big change. And also in El Paso, Texas, which is the far western part of the state, CBP is now releasing people who they put in jail. I mean, these people were charged, and the charges are being dropped, the criminal charges, and they're moving them into a nonprofit shelter so that they can start the process of reunification.
So start the process of reunification, and we're quickly running out of time, but I have to ask you, has anyone talked about the trauma this type of separation does to children being torn away from their parents at such a young age?
Yes, there's a lot of talk about this by psychologists, child psychiatrists, by people who are pediatricians who've been into these shelters where the kids have been separated. You know, I think in the short run, when you see any particular child, the response might vary. For example, the child that I saw who was reunified seemed very cheerful, the 5-year-old. He had a nightmare 2 days after he was released, which was unusual for him, according to the mother. But, you know, it's really hard to say in the short run what's going on with these kids. But people who studied this kind of separation say that it creates attachment difficulties in the future, and things can play out in the long run for a very long time in a person's life.